Jonathan did a fantastic job of introducing the title. And I'll just say that what I'm going to talk about today is a work in progress. So very much open to suggestions and ideas for how to improve it. It's not yet published. And it's a collaboration with, like Jonathan mentioned, a few philosophers and historians at a group called the Gender Sci Lab that's based at Harvard University. And that I started working with when I was a PhD student. So this is really fuzzy, another disclaimer, it's double fuzzy for two reasons. One, I think probably I should have found a less fuzzy photograph, but also because we're doing that thing, which I haven't done since the pandemic days, when you take a portion of the screen when you're doing presenter view. Anyway, so I apologize for the low resolution of this, but just imagine that you could see more pixels.
Sharing the slide.
I'll be sharing the slide.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. We think of such things. Yes.
I just I wasn't sharing.
Yes, they're being shared on YouTube. So anyways, imagine this with more pixels. So in November 2023, and this will feel, when we started writing this paper, it was a very different political climate. So this feels like another world, but stay with me for now, and then we'll think about what the implications are in the current world that we live in. But this is November 2023, and US President Joe Biden is in the midst of signing a presidential memorandum creating the first White House initiative on women's health research with a focus on precision medicine. So on either side of him in the Oval Office stood, on one side we have First Lady Jill Biden, and she's set to lead the initiative. And on the other side we have Maria Shriver, who's a founder of the Women's Alzheimer's Movement. This moment kind of signified an increasing attention to women's health in the US, as well as the influence of the gendered burdens of Alzheimer's disease, specifically in motivating this increased attention. So this is kind of a big moment in this push to this kind of political and epistemic push towards paying attention to women's health. And so what I'm going to talk to you all about today is a story and an argument about the intersection of these two simultaneously scientific and political domains. On the one hand, women's health research and this notion of sex-based medicine and the need to pay attention to sex and gender in medicine. And on the other side, the purportedly kind of new, kind of future-oriented world of precision medicine, where we use kind of big data and machine learning to tailor and individualize care to each individual patient as they come into the room. So it's like this kind of specter on the horizon of a new way of doing medicine. So I'm interested in the intersection of these two domains. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to start with just some kind of background information to situate you, the audience, on these two domains. So first of all, kind of women's health and its history, and second, precision medicine. Then I'm going to do a kind of case study-ish analysis of a very particular intersection of women's health and precision medicine, known as the Women's Brain Project, which is this massive nonprofit multi-country kind of consortium aimed at addressing disparities in kind of diseases such as Alzheimer's diseases and other neurological diseases between men and women. And then finally, I'm going to make the argument or try to build the claim that this particular intersection, as kind of exemplified through the Women's Brain Project, facilitates or entrenches bioessentialism, which I'll explain what that means. And I'm going to do that through three examples and pointing out three different processes or mechanisms by which this entrenchment happens. And so, what I'm going to end up arguing is that what looked at first, or what looks and is in some ways a huge step forward with respect to both kind of the scientific and the ethical dimensions of kind of gender equity in healthcare, is far more complicated and more problematic than it first seems. And then we're going to think about it in the current political context. Okay, so the history of women's health, it has been kind of, in the recent contemporary moment, it's been kind of well understood and well publicized that there's quote unquote a female problem. So how male bias in medical trials ruined women's health. This is an article from The Guardian in 2019. Also in kind of medical, kind of gray matter literature, like publications have put forth on concerns about gender bias in medical research, the missing other half of medicine. So the kind of general idea here is that there's been this history of androcentrism in medicine. So there's this kind of stemming from this idea that the kind of normal or healthy subject, or the standard against which all bodies are measured and what counts as the kind of species typical norm or the healthy body, has long been the kind of white male body of a certain height and weight and etc., able-bodied. And this example comes from, this is literally Reference Man, introduce you all here to Reference Man, who was created as part of a task force on, or part of a scientific research project looking at the effects of radiation. And so what the scientists in the 1970s wanted to know is, to understand the effects of radiation, how do we know whether there's something going wrong or right? We need a standard to measure it against. So they created the standard of Reference Man, which is kind of like the control standard. So Reference Man is defined as being between 20 to 30 years of age, weighing 70 kilograms, 170 centimeters, and lives in a climate with an average temperature of 10 to 20 degrees, is Caucasian, and is a Western European or North American in habitat and custom. So this is a direct quote from the publication. So yeah, so people, women's health advocates and others have pointed out that there's a problem here. And essentially, it's resulted in a case where the kinds of medicines that we produce and the clinical trials we run and the kind of tests for adverse side effects are all kind of relative to Reference Man. And so for those who have bodies that fit outside of kind of Reference Man standard, we just simply don't know information, like important information, like how their bodies respond, how diseases progress, risk factors for diseases. And so it's known, as they say, as kind of like this missing other half of medicine. There's a lot more to this history that's really, really interesting, including concerns how kind of the exclusion of women from medicine was partly as a result of these ideas about what counts as kind of like the normal or the natural, the healthy human, but also in response to ideas about quote unquote kind of protecting women. So as a result of the thalidomide scandal in the 1970s or 80s, in which pregnant women took part in a trial, and then it ended up being that the kind of babies were formed. It was then that all pregnant women were banned from participating in pregnant trials, but not only pregnant women. For a while, it was anyone of a childbearing age, any women over, so you didn't have to be pregnant or claim to be pregnant. So we have this whole history in which women were essentially excluded. And then there were additionally other arguments being like, because of menopause, not menopause, because of the menstrual cycle, women's are somehow, bodies are too kind of variable and changeable, and so they don't really work as a good standard. And so we just, in order to control the variation, let's just test on like male human subjects, male rats and mice and other kind of animal models, etc. So this all together created this concern about androcentrism. And and one domain, and this kind of resulted, according to women's health advocates, in a huge, like I said, a huge number of implications for women's health in general and what we know about women's health. And one domain in which this picked up among many, you might think of some of the other kind of famous domains are like heart disease. So there's like a lot of concern that women's heart disease symptoms present differently from those of men. So the classic like left-hand side or whatever, like these particular symptoms appear more commonly in men rather than women, and so we fail to recognize when a woman is having a heart attack or at risk, and so this leads to, epistemic and ethical injustice. Another realm is the one that I'm going to be focusing on today, is Alzheimer's dementia. So this is a publication from Alzheimer's.org, which is one of the big advocacy medical groups for Alzheimer's, explaining and trying to, making the case that Alzheimer's disease is a women's issue. And this has been kind of taken up in like media publications as well. So there's concern that the majority of the people who have Alzheimer's in the world are women, this is, so for instance, for almost 2/3 of American living with Alzheimer's are women. God, it's so, such poor pixelation, sorry about that. And then it is also conflated with, in the literature a lot, with the fact that it's also caregivers who are women tend to be women, and they tend to experience higher levels of burden of depression and impaired health than men. More than 60% of Alzheimer's and domestic caregivers are women. So basically, yeah, so this is a disease. In effect, the argument is that Alzheimer's disease disproportionately affects women, and we have limited research on the ways that Alzheimer's affects women and how it manifests in women and the drugs for treating women. So we have a really big problem here. So there was a kind of political push to say that we need to change this. And this is not just a women's issue, but this is a kind of also Alzheimer's disease in particular is seen as this kind of looming problem on the horizon. It's only growing. So literally, it's talked about at times as the dementia storm on the horizon, this worry that as populations age, and some of you may have heard this kind of rhetoric, especially in quote unquote Western countries, we're going to get this kind of like demographic burden of the older generations. And part of this is going to be felt on account of the higher rates of Alzheimer's. And so if that's the case, if this is like a looming, health and economic burden for future societies, and it disproportionately affects women, and we don't know enough about like women's health and Alzheimer's, then it kind of really builds up this impetus for kind of changing how Alzheimer's research is done. So a response to this, to the Alzheimer's case, but also just to the kind of dearth of research on women in health in general, was a series of kind of political mandates that this one in the US is called the sex as a biological variable mandate, which basically was from the National Institutes of Health. And again, what's happening to this mandate now, I don't know, but in the early 90s, it was basically required that in order to get NIH funding, so this is access to billions of dollars in funding, scientists must consider sex as a biological variable in their research. What does it mean to consider sex as a biological variable? Usually it tends to mean, so there's lots of kind of like literature explaining what it means, but it tends to mean disaggregating by sex, or if you don't disaggregate by sex, and this is binary sex, and this is both at the level of clinical trials of humans, but also in preclinical trials, so involving mouse models and also cells themselves, you need to consider sex as a biological variable, disaggregate your data by sex to see and compare if there are differences across sex in your research. And this is how we're going to redress this history of androcentrism and solve these problems. There's also similar mandates in Canada and the European Union. Really recently in the UK, I think this was just a few months ago that it officially passed or was published or whatever it is. This group called Message is a leading co-design and implementation of a policy framework for UK research funders to ensure that biomedical health and care researchers account for sex and gender in their funding applications and their research projects. So this is kind of like the sex as biological variable mandate that is now being implemented in the UK. So this is still like a very live policy program. Okay, so I bring you up a kind of very brief overview summary of kind of what's happening in the world of women's health and the kind of ethical and epistemological arguments about why we need to pay attention and to include women in research, and the kind of sex as biological variable solutions that are put forth. So on the other side, something else is also happening in medicine at this time, which is the kind of advent, or so-called advent of precision medicine. So what is precision medicine? The goal of precision medicine is to target the right treatments to the right patient at the right time by taking into account differences in their individual disease, general health, genes, environment, and lifestyle. So the idea is that current medicine, according to this picture, is kind of one treatment fits all. So cancer patients come in with colon cancer, and if you have colon cancer, you're given the colon cancer like best practice therapy to treat it, right? In the future, instead people come in with colon cancer, we take all of their data, which we did in the past too, but it's not just blood, DNA, and urine data. What's actually interesting is when it goes beyond biomedical data, and advocates of precision medicine argue that in the future we're going to use kind of credit card data that looks at the kind of foods that you buy and where you travel and your Fitbit stuff too, and like your social media to how connected you are, like basically all like, quantified self all of this data is going to be fed into the algorithms that then going to output not just like, oh, people with colon cancer, drug, but people with colon cancer who are this, and eat this much healthy food and are women and whatever, are going to need this specific cocktail, like tailored, individualized treatment. So, so that's kind of the vision, and this represents machine learning. Because we have big data and these whole, tools of being able to aggregate data and look for patterns that we before now were never able to see. This is going to be possible. And so you see President Barack Obama talking about this. He writes, this is in 2015. Tonight, I'm launching a new precision medicine initiative to bring us closer to curing diseases like cancer and diabetes, and to give us all access to the personalized, and this is, you might already be, pay attention to this personalized bit because it creates a really interesting puzzle that I want to discuss with you later. But personalized information, we need to keep ourselves and our families healthier. This one, you wouldn't just wear any pair of glasses. Your prescription is tailored to your vision. So it's this idea like, of course, I have been in the background and I want to discuss questioning like, is this really a new, like, what were we doing? Is like the old, is this a difference in kind in terms of kind of medical programs and visions, or is this really a difference in degree? Because you would think that in the past, yes, we didn't have all of this data, but certainly we never intended to, our goal was always to tailor and personalize to some degree. That's why we ask, for instance, how old you are when you come in, and we have different dosages and drugs for children versus adults. And so I am unsure of how much of this is just kind of rhetoric and how much of it is like, well, we can amp it up to such a degree that now we're able to really individualize in a way that before we could only partly individualize or kind of get part of the way there. But irrespective of whether or not these are two different paradigms, they are certainly presented as kind of the new and kind of the future, and also as something different. Okay, so there's precision medicine. And so now, this is the phenomenon that I want us to kind of explore kind of philosophically today, is this idea of sex-based precision medicine. So there have been this movement kind of in which like the new future of precision medicine, the push for women's health have kind of come together in this way. And there is funding agencies and science labs and training programs that are all coalescing around this idea of, quote, sex-based precision medicine. So you can't see it, but Tulane awarded 11.2 million NIH grant to pioneer sex-based precision medicine, and this was last summer in 2024. There's all this kind of guidance from like the corporate kind of women's tech, women's like invest in women's health side of precision medicine, how sex and gender drive innovation. These are some quotes from within the Tulane article. So the PIs on that project, right, they're viewing the patient through a sex and gender lens as a first step towards personalizing care for the past century. And here he is, the reference man. The 170-pound man has been the representative of the human species, but if you treat all women according to a man's biology, you will hurt them, said the lead PI. Our goal is to identify and harness these different biological forces to help us treat them equally. Oh yes, and then there's also just an add-in, a parallel argument in favor of things like sex-based precision medicine happening around in the machine learning kind of fairness literature, which is like if we have these big like precision medicine algorithms that don't pay attention to differences between men and women, then we basically risk building algorithms that are tailored towards men and end up hurting women. And so there's kind of a parallel argument that if we don't kind of put sex front and center, then we're going to kind of perpetuate and reproduce, as is often kind of the language used in this field, like reproduce these existing harms and biases because they exist in the data, and therefore, unless we pay attention, our algorithms are only going to reproduce and amplify them. So there's these strong arguments and a lot of money, at least until recently, being placed into this idea of sex-based precision medicine. Okay, so that's the background. So what I want to talk about today is this particular example of sex-based precision medicine in action that's having like a very large influence on in neuroscience. And so this is a group called the Women's Brain Project, like I mentioned, and their kind of new proposal for a sex and gender precision medicine institute. So they see themselves as firmly aligned with this kind of future of precision medicine. So this group, which is a consortium of neuroscience researchers from around the world, write that their mission is to transform the development of drugs and medical treatments through considering sex and gender factors, and this is really interesting, as a gateway to precision medicine and care. That's the kind of title of their big paper announcing their project. They claim that one, sex is an essential component of the phenotypic heterogeneity of Alzheimer's dementia, and therefore two, the diagnostic and prognostic value of biomarkers can differ for men and women. This means that we need, quote, a new AI-powered biomarker-based clinical framework that is sex-sensitive. So this is the vision they're offering. What does this look like in practice? Oh, I swear it's so much. It's okay. I'll just read it to you. This, in real life, this is really interesting when you can actually read the word. But
you can make that bigger if you want. If it's important.
I can. How do
Present
I?
view, you can adjust the size of the two bits.
Okay, hold on. Oops, back. You know what?
It might not be important though, the finer detail.
Well, yeah, I'll lead you through it. Follow you. You have to trust me on this one, just for time, because it's going to take me so long back with that. But okay. So what does this look like in practice? Like, it's all well and good to be like, we need sex-based precision medicine. Sex is the gateway. But like, what does that mean in terms of the proposals for how actual scientific research is done? So the Women's Brain Project proposes implementing a sex-specific approach, this is what they call it, at every single stage of Alzheimer's dementia research, from modeling, assessment, and diagnosis, all the way to treatment. So in data generation stages, so the preclinical and clinical research stages, this requires equal contribution of female and male animals, the study of sex chromosomes in Alzheimer's dementia, studying the impact of hormonal shifts on ADRD biomarker dynamics, stratifying and including wide ranges of demographic, imaging, genetic, clinical, and biomarker data, and reporting sex-related effects. And then at the disease modeling stage, and this is particularly interesting for this research question, this requires implementing sex-sensitive deep learning algorithms and incorporating sex as a quote-unquote desirable bias in training sets. So that's this picture that they have, and if you could read it, you would see that at every stage there's a different way of identifying sex. And of course, this is all with the with the intention of redressing this history of androcentrism. We are going to kind of ferret out reference man from our data with a kind of program like this. Okay, so briefly, so we have this under our belts. You've heard me use many of these terms interchangeably, partly because the people I study use them interchangeably, but for the purposes of this project, I will more generally use sex-specific algorithm as the term, but, or actually, here I contradict myself. I use sex-stratified algorithms, sometimes also called sex-specific algorithms and sex-sensitive algorithms as an umbrella term to refer to machine learning approaches that do one of the three following things. So first, they incorporate sex categories as a source of predictive information. Second, they build a separate computational model for each sex. They just have to do one of these things. And or finally, include different numerical cutoffs or relevant predictive features for each sex. So it's an algorithm that either asks you to input sex as a variable in order to give a prediction of, say, your risk factor, your likelihood to develop Alzheimer's disease. This other one, which is kind of this idea of pink and blue algorithms, that so depending on your sex, you either get given like algorithm A or algorithm B. And then the first one is that there are different numerical cutoffs or relevant prediction features for each sex. So this is kind of like sex corrections idea. So if you are, you output a result for a risk factor of Alzheimer's, and they're like, okay, well, if it's a woman, add 3 or whatever to the result at the end. So that's a kind of post hoc kind of correction. One thing of many that's really interesting in this domain is how the rhetoric around sex-based precision medicine and sex-stratified algorithms contrasts to many of the discussions happening in the medical field around race corrections. So this is a commentary from Josh Denny and Francis Collins. Francis Collins was the head of the NIH for a while, introducing their vision for precision medicine in 2030, 7 ways to transform healthcare. What's really interesting is that precision medicine on the race side of things is presented as a quote unquote post-race kind of medical movement. So this is what they write in this paper. With a growing depth of data, we have an opportunity to replace adjustments for race and ethnicity with more specific measures. In particular, they write, race conflates a plethora of social, cultural, political, geographic, and biologic factors together and can perpetuate systemic racism. Routine collection of social determinants of health in both research and clinical care, in combination with more precise measures of environmental influences, habits, and genetic ancestry, provide more rational etiology-based adjustments and yield better risk stratifications of treatment. So there's this idea that precision medicine, because it's tailored to an individual, we don't need these classifications anymore like race, which risk introducing racism and have all kinds of politically toxic effects. Instead, we don't need these categories. We can move beyond these kind of broad and precise social categories. You see it across in other places. They're trying to in the past, they used to have race corrections and race-based algorithms in a similar way to kind of correct for kind of the history of like the focus on white bodies. But now they're being removed. There's this concerted effort across like many fields of saying, so this is the American Heart Association is updating its risk prediction tool with a race-free approach. So no longer will we give different results for men and for Black people and white people. That's problematic now. Instead, we're going to have a risk calculator that doesn't kind of correct for sex. And then, yeah, so, right. So its race-free approach reflects the need to prioritize health equity when approaching prediction and prevention of CVD, said corresponding study author. Right, so this is kind of the future of kind of race correction. And there's general kind of agreement on this, that we were doing, when we were correcting by sex, or using race-based algorithms in kind of race-based medical treatment plans, there was a tendency to conflate what was a social variable, as Colin said, for a biological variable, and that ended up promoting racism. So that was like the wrong way to go. And it's such an interesting contrast because in this very same article on the kind of cardiovascular kind of race-free approach and removing race from their algorithms, they say right underneath, PREVENT, which is the name of the algorithm, uniquely quantifies risks for CVD for each biological sex. So almost kind of without argument, kind of sex-based algorithms are still left inside. So I know we've been talking for a while, but hopefully, so I kind of at this stage want to kind of propose my central question and what I think my argument or answer will be. So what I want to know in this project is what happens when a big data medical research program, rather than overlooking sex and gender variables, is centrally oriented around the category of sex. So what are the implications of that? And what I want to suggest today is that such a program risks uncritically baking essentialized gender sex markers of human difference into medicine. That is, it can fix attention on binary sex in the explanation of disparities in disease burden and lead to a biological sex essentialist inference that gender sex differences are driven by some property essential to maleness or femaleness. So this is what I want to argue. Biological sex essentialism, just so we have a definition to work with, this comes from Sarah Richardson's piece on sex contextualism, and she defines it as referring to concepts and practices where sex is defined by a set of binary fixed variables that are facts of biology found in nature across species and ecologies, uncontroversially scientific and omnipresent throughout the body, so that every tissue at every level of biological organization can be categorized as male or female. So one of the kind of guiding mantras for the sex as biological variable and like message folks is every cell has a sex. So sex is something kind of throughout biology. Okay. So this is what I'm going to argue. The first thing to know and to be clear about is that AD science, Alzheimer's dementia science, is contested science. This is defined as science that's not only empirically undetermined by currently available evidence, but also involves persistent and unresolved disputes over the fundamental categories of knowledge, relevance of different forms of evidence, and authority of particular forms of expertise. In the paper we're writing, I have a lot of empirical research showing this, but I'll just summarize it for you all now, but we can talk about it more, which is essentially that there is kind of very prominent contestation over how to explain the disparities in the burden of Alzheimer's disease between men and women. Is it how much of it can be explained by the differences in how long men and women live, how much of it can be explained by kind of gendered social factors such as occupations and educations, which might have affected the birth cohorts that we are now measuring, testing for Alzheimer's disease. And there's been a significant amount of work that suggests that, sexism itself and other kind of gendered experiences can explain cognitive impairment in a whole range of different factors better than some kind of quote unquote innate male or female kind of biology. So while it's likely that Alzheimer's emerges from a complex of biological and lifestyle and environmental factors, there is little consensus about the relative importance of an interaction between biological and social variables in these gender sex disparities in AD. So that's pretty much the state of the field. And this is also kind of further compounded by the fact that Alzheimer's dementia itself is facing a huge number of contestations around kind of questions around fraud and whether or not treatments are as efficacious as they've been purported to be. And so what we have really is sex-based medicine entering this very, very contested field, basically of a disease that is itself extremely heterogeneous and multifactorial, of which there's very little agreement on like whether it even is a single disease or it's multiple diseases at once. So, John, do I have like 2:45? Is that when we normally stop for questions?
Well, you can go longer than that if you like.
Okay, well, we haven't, or when do we finish? At 3:30?
We've got until 3:30 in total, yeah,
Okay,
but of course,
I want to
time
leave
for questions is great, of course.
Yes. All right, so I'm going to try and say the end quickly because I need your help with figuring out where to go next. All right, so in order to make my claim that sex-based medicine, sex-based precision medicine is actually entrenching biological sex essentialism. So even though it's purported to be quote unquote a good, it's actually making things worse in some ways. My collaborators and I decided to dig into the literature. So what we did is we did a literature review of the biomedical literature that uses sex variables and predictive models for estimating AD risk. We found that studies use a whole variety of tools, such as neural networks, decision trees, classifier models. I'll talk a little bit more about them later, so don't know what those are. These models compute basically an AD risk score or assign an AD risk status on the basis of individual patient demographics, biomarkers, and behavioral data. So it's very kind of precision medicine, like in that mode. In cases such as the Women's Brain Project, sex categories are a central analytic because sex disparities and sex disease pathways are an explicit focus of the research program. So one of the questions we asked is like, why are people including sex? We looked at I showed the cardiovascular prevent algorithm, and it was just like, it's almost included as a matter of course. Of course, we're going to segregate or stratify by sex. And so looking through this biomedical literature, we looked at 25 papers at the time. We found a variety of different, most of the time it was not justified, which is one of the categories here, but we're kind of an implied variety of reasons about why sex was included. So in some cases, it was because they're engaged in a sex-based medicine program. It's like sex is the explicit focus. We want to understand sex-based pathways of Alzheimer's disease. In other cases, there was just a simply assumption, it wasn't that sex was the central kind of research focus, but rather an assumption that sex is always an important moderating factor in Alzheimer's dementia. At other times, it was because of programs like SABV and Message that I talked about, so institutional mandates that gender sex categories be included. Another example, some of the articles we looked at talked about a desire to make tools for clinical settings, where the sex category is ubiquitous demographic variable accessible to physicians. So this argument, we did some interviews with some of the PIs on these papers, and they were simply like, well, this is the data we have. We have data on sex, as well as kind of age, other things. So we want these algorithms to be useful. We want the clinicians to be able to input data they actually have. They have sex, so let's build sex-based algorithms. And then finally, this one might be familiar to some of you who kind of work in the kind of machine learning, like, what's it called? It's not like it's not unregulated, but it's the machine learning where you throw everything in. And what's the word for that?
Unsupervised?
Unsupervised, that's it. I know, I was like, I know they're doing something wild out there. So the unsupervised machine learning. So there's everything but the kitchen sink approach that inputs all of it available variables and allows an algorithm to select the most predictive one. So this idea that like, we don't have a hypothesis, we don't think sense, we're agnostic as to the importance of sex, we're not even focused in it, but it's there, we've got it, let's throw it in and see what the machine gives us. So amongst these 25 papers, we picked 3, and I think I'll probably talk about maybe 1 or 2 right now. This is the final part of the talk. That kind of exemplified, we think, a kind of precise and exact way that, that the sex-based precision medicine is doing this work of entrenching bioessentialism. So the first is this process that we called effacing contested knowledge. And so we're picking one paper here to exemplify this. This is this paper by Qui et al. From 2020, the title, Development and Validation of an Interpretable Deep Learning Framework for Alzheimer's Disease Classification. So this was published in the journal Brain. And what this study did is it aimed to develop an algorithm for calculating individualized AD risk that can help neurologists kind of diagnose patients in clinical contexts. To do this, the team trained a neural network to use an MRI scan, so this kind of biometric data, and generate a, quote, disease probability map, so that they defined as a precise, intuitive visualization of individual Alzheimer's disease risk across a person's brain anatomy. As illustrated in figure 2, which comes from their paper, they then trained a second neural network to use this probability map to predict whether the individual has Alzheimer's, testing its performance on 3 external data sets. And so here's where sex comes in. The study found that adding non-neuroimaging data, specifically data from what's called the mini mental state examination score, which is this questionnaire that's like, widely used to assess cognitive impairment, age, and what they call gender, as inputs in the second neural network, increased predictive performance by up to 15%. The team's neural networks performed more accurately than a team of 11 neurologists who examined the MRI scan as well as the additional data. Okay, so they're basically finding that if you add in this extra information, age, score from this questionnaire, and gender, it improves the predictive ability of the algorithm. So what is gender? The study operationalizes gender as male or female. And this is crucial, in contrast to other model inputs, the inclusion of gender is not elaborated or justified. So in the paper, the researchers further contextualize the inclusion of the questionnaire scores as a current standard of diagnosis, and they justify the inclusion of age as a means of controlling for, quote, the natural progression of cerebral morphological changes over the lifespan, citing literature showing a clear proportionality between age and Alzheimer's dementia. Although gender is included here without a hypothesis about its causal relationship to AD, so this is one of those cases where they don't claim to say that there's a sex-based pathway or to be focusing on sex. The authors report that, quote, when age, gender, and MMSE information was added to the model, the performance increased significantly. So together with the statement that gender is a known Alzheimer's disease risk factor, the research team's findings imply that machine learning tools have identified these binary sex categories as offering valuable predictive information about AD sex. So that is the implication that comes out of this. So what myself and my collaborators argue here is that in this example of Qui et al., sex is incorporated into models without an explicit hypothesis about the causal pathways between sex and AD outcomes. That is, in a manner agnostic to the reasons for the predictive value of sex variables. So you can imagine it as happened in, if you were to talk to the head of the study, they were saying, well, we don't mean to say that like Alzheimer's is a different disease between men and women, or that the causes for the reasons why sex improves the predictive value of the algorithm is anything to do with, hormones or innate biology or anything. We're entirely agnostic to that. We have the data, and so we just threw it in. This is a common feature of precision medicine, machine learning approaches, which are often solely or primarily interested in predictive power, in contrast to approaches aimed at identifying causal mechanisms. So predictive machine learning-based research need not posit a causal role for AD. Likewise, it need not resolve whether sex variables are a measure of biological factors or a proxy for other variables such as gender or gendered exposures. And this is often quoted as like one of the great advantages of precision medicine. We can move forward despite not knowing cause. We can at least see kind of explore the correlations and gain predictive power without making any claims to causation. However, and this is the argument, causal agnosticism in these claims to causal agnosticism, we suggest can work to quote, to efface contested knowledge about the contributors to observe sex differences in health status. So in this example, female sex is referenced as a known Alzheimer's disease factor and incorporated into the neural network without any acknowledgement of the ongoing debates about the underlying determinants of female risk. Causally agnostic machine learning strategies then enter a space of speculation, hype, uncertainty, and contestation about the importance of sex differences in understanding the distribution of health and diseases. These models operate in a world in which binary sex is ubiquitously available in data sets, and biomedical research programs are higher resourced and hold greater epistemological status than research programs on social variables. So we argue that these researchers incorporate sex as a predictive variable without engaging in contestations over what that variable captures socially or biologically. And given the context and the world in which it enters, this ends up, despite claims to causal agnosticism, simply still kind of effacing all of these contestations and making it seem as if there's a kind of resolved view about the predictive value of sex. So that's one argument I want to make. A related point of the three processes is that what sex-based precision medicine risks doing is obscuring the social, and this is another means by which bioessentialism is entrenched in these algorithms. So this is similar, but not exactly the same as effacing contested knowledge. So this is a 2019 paper. The authors used data from the Framingham Heart study, which is this like longitudinal, big kind of data set in the US. And they aim to reduce subjectivity and variability in neurologist clinical assessment by producing a more objective, computationally driven diagnostic process. They used an algorithm to combine and assess results from multiple psychiatric tests, and they stratified these by different demographic and AD risk factors. So to do this, the authors stratified the data sets of the data on all of these different patients, creating two sex-specific branches, one for males and one for females in their decision tree algorithm. And basically what they found is that after building these algorithms and doing this research, they discovered that there were different tests. So you can do different kind of neurophysical tests and biomarker tests on individuals, and that the top 5 most useful tests were different than the top for men than they were for women. So basically, if you wanted to test whether or to assess the risk of Alzheimer's in an individual, you want to be using different tests for women than you do for men. And then they discovered this by kind of collecting and aggregating this data. So basically, in the end, they argued for kind of sex-specific screening algorithms for men and women. So essentially for kind of creating pink and blue algorithms. And so what we kind of suggested and argued is that in this study, these observed sex differences in the optimal neuropsychological test profiles could, of course, reflect differences in gendered educational or occupational experiences, which impact testing comfort and performance, rather than in any inherent differences between groups and aspects of sex-linked biology. However, the question of whether these findings are due to gender-sex differences in testing or measurement validity, rather than like some underlying etiology in the disease, goes unasked. So kind of obscuring the social. So it's kind of similar to the first example. And also obscures the possibility of like, might there have been other ways to disaggregate this data based on, say, could it be education or age that might have been just as conducive and important or more so than doing it by sex. So that's mechanism 2. And then the third and final mechanism is what we call ossifying the sex binary. And so I illustrate this through this paper, 2022 paper by Harms et al. This is actually a group from the Women's Brain Project who published this paper together, alongside a company, Altoida Inc., whose mission is to, quote, unleash the power of digital biomarkers to ignite an era of precision neurology. So in the studies, the author demonstrated that a machine learning classifier could use digital biomarker data to predict the self-reported sex of healthy patients. So using 793 biomarkers capturing features of cognitive processing and physiology, which were collected from participants completing these kind of motor tasks and augmented reality test, the sex classifier demonstrated that it could successfully distinguish the sex of participants with good predictive performance. This finding is in turn interpreted as validating the importance of sex classifiers in quote unquote precision neurology. So essentially, you could ask a group of people to take a series of tests, motor tests and augmented reality tests, and then just healthy patients, and then you could back predict what sex they were. So from their results, you could determine, oh, this person is classified as male or classified as female. The researchers then further found that the classifier performed more poorly on a data set of patients with Alzheimer's dementia as compared to the healthy patients. So now take a group of people who've been diagnosed with Alzheimer's dementia, and the classifier is worse at back predicting whether or not that the individual is a male or female. And the researchers interpret this difference in the classifier's predictive performance as evidence that sex-based neurocognitive profiles change across the course of AD progression. So in other words, they interpret the differential performance of the classifier going from healthy to diseased states as evidence of a difference both in a sex difference both in healthy patients and a sex difference in how the disease progresses. So the fact that this machine, like this classifier is able to do this, and the fact that its ability gets worse with AD simply shows that there's a sex-based difference in how AD progresses between men and women. So it's showing two things, difference in healthy brains and a difference in like the nature of Alzheimer's disease, according to these theorists. So the authors end up concluding that more data on sex differences could guide future clinical practice, informing choices for prevention, diagnosis, and treatment. And we suggest that this is a case where the sex binary, this kind of like idea that male versus female is like a central analytic, is ossified through the use of a machine learning classifier that groups participants into these two sex categories. And this supports the idea that the quantitative analysis of biomarkers reveals and validates maleness as femaleness as discrete binary categories informative for clinical practice. And so the pursuit of sex-stratified algorithm also then loops back to the laboratory to substantiate the search for sex differences in biomedical research and validate the legitimacy of binaries and data collection, which ultimately provides more data suitable for sex-stratified algorithms. So when they do the sex-based medicine, they put the classifier in, they find, oh, look, we can successfully predict sex. This means sex is important. This means sex is critical. We need to go out and collect even more data by sex, which then loops back to be fed into future kind of algorithms. And so they're almost kind of motivating and creating their own impetus for the need for kind of sex-based data. Yeah, so in this way, the propagation of sex-stratified algorithms could become internally sustaining. If such algorithms are ultimately applied in the clinic, this portends the routinization of binary sex categories and predictive tools as part of the future medical and precision medicine infrastructure. So I kind of said this a little bit here. To summarize, sex is included as a matter of course. When sex makes a difference to the algorithm's accuracy or decision nodes, as it almost always does, because sex is a like massively influential feature of the world in which we live, this ends up looping back to substantiate the sex difference frame in biomedical research. Just so in other words, to kind of validate this idea that yes, we need sex-based medicine, validate the legitimacy of binaries and data collection practices, and ground calls for sex-specific risk assessment in the clinic, even though it's acknowledged that the model is non-explanatory and cannot discern whether sex serves as a proxy for something else. So the propagation of sex-stratified approaches is internally sustaining, where each component of the cycle is mutually justifying. Sex is ossified in these big data logics and algorithmic tools. In a sense, it can never not be important anymore. If such algorithms are ultimately applied in the clinic, yeah, this portends routinization. So that's pretty much the summary of the critique, which I kind of just gave. So yeah, so basically in the context of contemporary AD research, Sex is included in machine learning models with minimal empirical justification on the basis of convenience or apparent self-evidence of the category's value, in continuity with the use of sex as a risk factor in earlier kind of women's health advocacy epidemiological contexts. Despite this massive dissensus about the existence of genuine sex differences in AD pathology, sex persists as one of a few usual suspect variables. The perceived utility of classifying by, correcting for, or disaggregating by sex stands in for actual evidence of putative underlying biological differences among individuals, to clinch the existence of distinct sex populations, and increases the likelihood of erroneously constructing Alzheimer's dementia in males and females as different diseases. So one of the frames, to summarize, that, or kind of one of the kind of guiding justifications or ideas in many of the sex-based precision medicine is to point to the algorithm and say, oh, look, it works. Like, it can back predict sex. It's more predictive when you stratify and have like a pink algorithm and a blue algorithm. Of course, we have this data. We're going to include it, so it works. And that is then given as evidence for the whole kind of program to start with, and the need to be collecting more and more data on kind of binary sex. And so what I'll leave us with is this question that we're thinking about, which is that I kind of led in with this like personalized precision. So as kind of philosophers, I imagine, at least for me, one of the questions that came at this was like, what's going on? Precision medicine is supposed to be individualized. Why isn't there something almost contradictory in the idea of sex-based precision medicine? Perhaps, as it's often said, it's seen as a gateway or as a first step. And so eventually we're going to kind of drop the sex and, you know, we're going to get post-sex just like we're interested in getting like post-race eventually. But nonetheless, it's still like the kind of mantle under which all of this research is going. And it makes you wonder, given that there's such awareness of kind of lack of consensus over what sex might mean, how it's operationalized differently in different contexts, how it so often stands in as a proxy for a whole range of other kind of mechanisms in the world. But to me, it seems like I can't think of anything less precise than sex-based precision medicine. So the question we're thinking about next is, what would it take to actually be precise? Do we need a kind of sex eliminativism? Do we need to get rid of sex in medicine? Kind of like the post-race idea that Francis Collins and others put forward. Do we need a kind of sex contextualism where sex means different things in different contexts? Or do we need something else entirely? And how do we do justice to the kind of ethical claims that motivated some of the push for sex-based medicine without end up kind of entrenching this essentialist approach? Thanks, everyone.